The stylomastoid foramen is just going to be a hole that's located between the styloid process and the mastoid process. The carotid canal is going to be a circular hole that will allow the internal carotid artery that we learned from the previous unit to enter the skull and provide blood to the brain. Now, it'll actually be located just medial to the styloid process, so on the inside. Foramen lacerum, we'll see it in more detail here in a moment, but this is actually formed when multiple of the bones of the skull come together and articulate. They form this hole. The jugular foramen is also another foramen that's going to be formed from the temporal bone articulating with the occipital bone. And this just allows the internal jugular vein to take blood from the brain back down to the heart. And also there's some cranial nerves that we'll learn in a separate lecture that are going to exit the skull through this foramen. Now, one thing about jugular foramen, when you actually look at it, it's not going to be a completely circular foramen, but it's actually going to have a curve to it, almost like the letter J has a curve to it. So that's one way to help remember which one it is. The internal auditory or acoustic meatus is just the ear hole on the inside. As we take a look here, we see the squamous portion of the temporal bone, this flattened portion. Here's the zygomatic process as it sticks out to the zygomatic bone. Will be located right about here. We see the external acoustic meatus or auditory meatus right here, the outside. The mastoid process is just the big bump behind the ear. See a little bit of the mandibular fossa where the mandible is actually going to sit in, but we'll see a better view from the inferior. Now, one thing I want to highlight is the mastoid portion. So the mastoid portion is this rough posterior section that includes the mastoid process. This is all just the mastoid portion that I've just highlighted. Now, from the inferior view, we can see a few more of these structures here. So here's the mastoid process, all this in the mastoid portion. So if you notice this little hole right here located between the mastoid process, and this is the styloid process, this sharp looking projection, that is where we find the stylomastoid foramen. We also see the mandibular fossa right here. So let's highlight this. And again, this is just a shallow depression that the mandible or lower jaw is going to sit in right there. Mandibular fossa. We can see the zygomatic process that sticks anteriorly to the zygomatic bone. We can also now see the carotid canal right here. So you can see this is a circular foramen. We see just a portion of the jugular foramen, but this is also, the whole thing will be formed when the occipital bone articulates with this temporal bone. Now from a medial view, we can see the rest of our structures. We see just a little bit of the styloid process sticking out here. We see the mastoid process. So again, this posterior section there is that mastoid portion. Here's our squamous portion. We can see now our internal acoustic meatus, so the ear hole on the inside. But one thing I want to highlight is the petrous portion. And the petrous portion is going to be this mountain ridge right here. That's going to house the inner and middle ear structures, but that is the petrous portion. So it looks like just a mountain ridge on the inside of the temporal bone. I'm going to erase this coloration so we can see it now. So again, this mountainous looking structure is the petrous portion. Now going off the sphenoid bone, we have a few important structures. We're going to get into a silly little story here on the next lecture, but the sella turcica is going to be actually translating to the Turkish saddle. That's a part of the sphenoid bone. The dorsum sellae is going to be almost like a back seat that sits on the sella turcica. The optic foramen are going to be the holes. The optic nerve is going to go